The following story is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner.
I always thought the hardest part of making it to the top was getting through the door, but it turns out the real nightmare starts once they actually let you in. My father spent 30 years driving a bus in Brooklyn just so I could have a shot at a corner office in Lower Manhattan, and for a few months I really believed I'd done it. I was the new director of talent strategy at Sterling Cross Media, a firm that manages more influence in a single afternoon than most people see in a lifetime. I had the tailored suits, the view of the Hudson, and a seat at the executive table. But looking back, I realized that seat wasn't there because they wanted my expertise. It was there because they needed a specific face to point at whenever someone asked why the 50th floor looked like a private club for the Ivy League elite. The office itself was intimidating. It was all glass, brushed steel, and the kind of silence that only comes from people making an incredible amount of money. On my first day, Arthur Sterling, the founder and the man who recruited me, walked me through the halls like I was a prize trophy. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me that the company needed a fresh perspective, someone with my grit and my track record. He said that Sterling Cross was ready to evolve, and he wanted me to be the architect of that evolution. I believed him. Honestly, when a man like Arthur Sterling tells you that you're the future of his legacy, you don't look for the fine print. You just start working. My first big task was overseeing the hiring for a senior creative lead. This was a high-stakes role, the kind of position that sets the tone for the entire department. I spent weeks vetting candidates, and one name kept rising to the top. His name was Andre. He had a portfolio that made the rest of the stack look like amateur hour, and he'd spent the last 6 years turning a boutique agency in Atlanta into a powerhouse. During our first Zoom call, the guy blew me away. He was sharp, he was innovative, and he had this way of talking about media that made you feel like you were seeing the future. I remember hanging up the phone and thinking that this was it. This was going to be my first major win, the kind of hire that proves why I was brought on board. I brought my recommendation to Alistair Caldwell, the VP of Operations. Alistair's the kind of guy who looks like he was born in a tuxedo. He's charming in a way that feels like a threat, and he has this habit of leaning back in his leather chair and looking at you like you're a curious specimen in a jar. I laid out Andre's credentials, showing him the growth metrics and the awards, and for a second, I thought he was actually impressed. He flipped through the folder, nodding along, and then he closed it with a soft thud that felt way heavier than it should have. Alistair looked at me and said that while Andre's numbers were certainly impressive, he just didn't feel like a culture fit for the 50th floor. I asked him what he meant by that, because the culture we were supposedly building was one of excellence and innovation. Alistair just smiled, that thin, polished smile that doesn't reach his eyes, and told me that there's an intangible quality to Sterling Cross that you can't see on a resume. He said we needed someone who understood the shorthand of the industry, someone who wouldn't need a map to find their way around the social circles our clients moved in. Before I could even push back, he slid a different folder across the desk. It was a guy named Brody. I opened it up and, honestly, I thought it was a joke. Brody had 18 months of experience at a firm owned by his uncle. His GPA was a mystery, and his portfolio was mostly just a collection of social media campaigns for a craft beer company that went bust. I looked at Alistair and told him, as professionally as I could, that this candidate wasn't even qualified for a junior role, let alone a senior, creative lead. Alistair didn't even blink. He told me that Brody was the son of a very close friend of the board, a man who had been a major investor in Sterling Cross since the beginning. He said that hiring Brody wasn't just about the role. It was about maintaining the relationships that kept the lights on in the building. Then he looked me dead in the eye and told me that, as the director of talent strategy, my job was to find a way to make Brody look like the right choice on paper. He told me to massage the narrative so the rest of the team wouldn't question it. I felt a pit form in my stomach. I told him that my reputation was on the line, and that passing over a candidate like Andre for someone like Brody was exactly the kind of practice I was hired to stop. Alistair stood up, smoothed out his suit, and walked over to the window. He didn't look back when he told me that I was hired to lead, not to revolt. He said that if I wanted to keep my seat at the table, I needed to learn which battles were worth fighting, and this one was already decided. That night, I stayed late. The cleaning crew was moving through the cubicles and the city lights were blurring against the glass. I couldn't stop thinking about Andre. I had to be the one to call him and tell him we were moving in a different direction, knowing full well that he was 10 times the man Brody would ever be. It felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked for. But then I noticed something on my computer. I was still logged into the HR portal, and I saw a notification for a file transfer that I hadn't authorized. It was a folder labeled Special Interest Archive. It was buried deep in a subdirectory that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside of the VP level, but because of a glitch in the new permissions I'd been granted, I could see it. I clicked on it, my heart hammering against my ribs, and that's when I saw the names. Hundreds of them. Resumes from the last 5 years, all of them top-tier talent, all of them people of color or from non-traditional backgrounds, and every single one of them had a small digital red tag attached to the file. I opened the metadata for Andre's file. The red tag wasn't just a label. It was a code. When I hovered over it, a text box appeared that simply read, Non-Legacy, Culture Risk, Refer to Alistair. I realized then that Alistair hadn't just rejected Andre because of a friend's son. He was running a ghost system. There was the public-facing hiring process that I was supposed to lead, and then there was the real one. A system designed to ensure that no matter how hard someone worked or how much talent they had, the 50th floor would always stay exactly the way Alistair wanted it. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my face, and I knew that if I stayed quiet, I wasn't just a witness to the bias. I was the one making it possible. I should have walked away then. I should have taken my things and left that night. But as I looked at that list of red-tagged names, I felt a surge of anger that I couldn't suppress. These people had their dreams killed by a digital tag they didn't even know existed. I decided right then that I wasn't going to be the diversity shield for Alistair Caldwell anymore. If he wanted a fight, I was going to give him one he never saw coming. But I had no idea just how deep the rot went, or that the man I trusted most in that building was the one who had handed Alistair the shovel. Knowing the truth is a burden that changes the way you breathe in a room. For the next few days, every time I walked past Alistair's office or sat in a meeting with the senior partners, I felt like I was wearing a wire, even though I was just carrying the weight of what I'd seen on that monitor. I'd look at the other directors, men and women who had been at Sterling Cross for a decade, and I'd wonder how many of them knew about the red tags. I'd wonder if they were the ones who had applied them in the first place. I spent my nights back in my apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the logic. It wasn't just a simple case of, we only hire people we know. It was more calculated than that. I started taking screenshots of the special interest folder and the metadata attached to the rejected candidates. I'm a data guy by trade, so I started looking for the patterns. What I found was a sophisticated cipher. The red tags weren't just for race or background, though that was a huge part of it. There was a secondary layer of scoring that Alistair used, something he called social capital. Basically, if you didn't have a certain type of pedigree, you were a 0 in his system. If you went to a state school, that was a point against you. If your parents weren't in the industry or didn't have a high net worth portfolio, you were flagged as a culture risk. But the most disturbing part was the referral bonus column. Normally, a referral bonus is a couple $1,000s given to an employee who recommends a good hire, but in Alistair's secret ledger, these bonuses were massive, sometimes $50,000 or $60,000, and they were all being paid out to a shell company that I couldn't find any public record for. It hit me then that this wasn't just about bias or keeping the right people in the room. This was a financial racket. Alistair was essentially selling seats at Sterling Cross to the highest bidder. In the office, the reality of this system was becoming a nightmare. Brody, the kid Alistair forced me to hire, was a complete disaster. He'd show up at 10:30 in the morning, smelling like expensive gin and expensive cologne, and spend his time talking loudly on his phone about his weekend in the Hamptons. He didn't know the first thing about creative strategy. He couldn't even run a basic analytics report without breaking the software. One afternoon, I was in the break room, getting coffee when I saw a guy named Samson. He was a lead analyst, one of the smartest guys on the floor, and someone who had been passed over for a promotion twice in the last 3 years. He was helping Brody fix a deck that was due in an hour, and I could see the exhaustion in Samson's eyes. Brody was leaning over his shoulder, literally telling him to make the font bigger because big fonts mean big ideas, and Samson was just nodding, his jaw tight. When Brody finally wandered off to go take a long lunch, I walked over to Samson. I asked him how he was doing, and he just looked at me with this hollow expression. He told me that he'd been doing the work of 3 people for the last year while guys like Brody got the titles and the bonuses. Then he said something that stopped me cold. He looked around to make sure nobody was listening and whispered that I shouldn't bother trying to help him. He said that guys like him were just the batteries that kept the building running, and once they were drained, Alistair would just swap them out for fresh ones. I told him that it didn't have to be that way, and that I was looking into things. Samson just gave me a sad, knowing smile and told me that he'd seen 3 other directors of talent try to look into things before me. He said they all ended up either taking a big payout to leave quietly or getting fired for some unrelated performance issue within 6 months. He told me to be careful because the walls in this building didn't just have ears, they had eyes too. That's when the paranoia really started to set in. I began noticing small things. My keycard would take a few extra seconds to authorize at the elevator. My computer would lag when I tried to access certain HR files that should have been part of my daily workflow. It felt like the system was starting to close in on me, like it knew I'd been poking around in the special interest folder. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone with real power to back me up, someone who could protect me from Alistair if things turned ugly. My mind immediately went to Arthur Sterling. He was the one who recruited me, the one who talked about evolution and legacy. He was the founder, for God's sake. Surely he wouldn't stand for Alistair running a literal crime ring inside his company. I scheduled a private dinner with Arthur at this quiet, wood-paneled steakhouse in Midtown where the servers knew him by name, and the tables were far enough apart that you could talk about anything without being overheard. Arthur looked every bit the elder statesman of the media world, sipping his scotch and listening with a grandfatherly nod as I started to lay it all out. I told him about the red tag system. I told him about the social capital scores and the way Andre had been bypassed for Brody. I even told him about the shell company and the suspicious referral bonuses. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being the architect of evolution he'd asked me to be. But as I talked, Arthur didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He let me finish, and then he set his glass down very slowly. He looked me in the eye and told me that I was a very bright young man with a very bright future, but that I was looking at a masterpiece and only seeing the dust on the frame. He told me that the system I was describing wasn't a glitch or a corruption. He called it the foundation. He explained that Sterling Cross didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed because of the relationships and the legacy that he and Alistair had spent 40 years building. He said that sometimes you have to ensure that the children of your investors are taken care of, so that the company can continue to provide jobs for people like me. Then his voice got a little colder. He told me that he'd personally authorized the special bonuses for Alistair, because Alistair was the one who did the heavy lifting. That kept the board happy. He looked at me and said that he'd brought me in because he thought I was smart enough to understand how the world actually works. He said he wanted me to be the face of the new Sterling Cross, but that being the face meant keeping my mouth shut about the guts of the operation. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check. He slid it across the table toward me. It was for $100,000. He told me it was a discretionary sign-on bonus that they'd forgotten to process when I started. He said I should take it, go on a nice vacation, and when I came back I should delete those screenshots I'd been taking and focus on making Brody look like a star. I stared at that check, and for a second, I felt the temptation. That money could pay off my student loans, help my dad retire, and give me a safety net I'd never had in my life. But then I thought about Andre and Samson and the hundreds of names in that red tag folder. I realized that Arthur wasn't my mentor. He was the architect of the cage, and Alistair was just the one who made sure the bars stayed polished. I didn't take the check. I stood up, thanked Arthur for the dinner, and told him I'd think about what he said. As I walked out of that restaurant and into the cold Manhattan night, I knew I'd just declared war on the two most powerful men in the industry, and I knew that by tomorrow morning, they wouldn't just be trying to buy me off, they'd be trying to destroy me. Walking into the office the next morning felt like stepping onto a battlefield where the other side had snipers I couldn't see. The air was different. People who usually gave me a quick good morning suddenly found something very interesting to look at on their shoes or their phones. My assistant, a girl who usually had a joke ready before I even sat down, wouldn't even meet my eyes. She just told me, in this weirdly flat voice, that Alistair wanted the final onboarding packet for Brody on his desk by noon. I knew exactly what was happening. Arthur had made the call. The discretionary bonus hadn't worked, so now they were shifting to the isolate and freeze phase. That's how these guys do it. They don't fire you immediately and make you a martyr. They make your life so miserable and your job so impossible that you eventually just quit, and then they can tell everyone you weren't a good fit after all. I went into my office and tried to log into the HR database, and sure enough, my access to the special interest folder was gone. Not just moved, completely wiped from my permissions, but they were arrogant. They thought I was just some diversity hire who knew how to give a good PowerPoint presentation. They didn't realize that before I got my MBA, I'd spent 3 years working in data security. I knew that once something is on a server, it's never really gone if you know where the back doors are, but I couldn't do this from my desk. I needed to know who else was being crushed by this machine. I waited until after 5, when the legacy crowd usually cleared out to go to their networking drinks, and I headed down to the 42nd floor. That was where the real work happened. The data analysts, the junior researchers, the people who actually kept the company's heart beating. I found Samson sitting at his desk, the glow of his monitors the only light in the corner. He looked up, and for a second, I thought he was going to tell me to leave. But then he saw my face, and he just sighed and pointed to a small, windowless conference room in the back. He told me to go in and wait. 10 minutes later, Samson walked in with 3 other people. There was a woman named Chloe from finance, a guy named David from legal, and a woman named Sarah who had been an executive assistant to the board for nearly a decade. We sat there in the dark, and I didn't lead with a speech. I just pulled out my phone and showed them the screenshots of the red tags. The silence in that room was heavy. Sarah was the first one to speak. She told me she'd seen the physical version of this 10 years ago, literal folders with handwritten notes on them. She said she thought it had stopped when Arthur started talking about inclusivity, but now she realized they'd just moved the rot into the cloud where it was harder to smell. Then David, the guy from legal, dropped the real bombshell. He told us that Alistair wasn't just taking referral bonuses. He'd found evidence of a recurring payment structure. Parents of these legacy hires weren't just investing in the company. They were paying a consulting fee to a private firm owned by Alistair's brother-in-law. It was a straight-up pay-to-play scheme. Alistair was selling seats at Sterling Cross to the children of the Manhattan elite and then using the company's diversity initiatives as a smokescreen to keep the regulators away. I asked them why they hadn't said anything. Chloe, the woman from finance, looked like she wanted to cry. She told me that every time someone tried to raise a flag, their performance reviews suddenly plummeted. They'd get put on performance improvement plans for things they didn't do, or they'd find their bonuses slashed for budgetary reasons. She said they called themselves the silent floor because that was the only way to survive, to be invisible and keep working while the people above them stole the credit and the future. I told them I wasn't going to be silent anymore. I told them what Arthur had said to me at dinner about me being the face while they were the guts. I told them I was going to the EEOC and I was going to the board, but I needed their help to connect the dots. I needed the financial records Chloe could see, the legal loopholes David knew about, and the history Sarah had lived through. For a long minute, nobody said anything. The risk was massive. If we failed, we'd all be blacklisted from the industry forever. But then Sampson stood up. He told us he was tired of fixing Brody's mistakes while his own career stayed in the basement. He said if I was willing to lead the charge, he was willing to provide the ammunition. We spent the next 4 hours in that secret room, as we started calling it, building a master file. We didn't just have the red tags now, we had the consulting fee invoices, the emails where Alistair explicitly told managers to downgrade minority applicants to avoid quota issues, and the records of the shell company payments. By the time I left the building at 2 a.m., I had a flash drive in my pocket that could level the 50th floor. I felt a weird mix of adrenaline and pure terror. I knew the moment I used this there was no going back. But as I walked toward the subway, a black SUV pulled up slowly alongside the curb. The window rolled down, and there was Alistair. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father catching a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. He told me he knew I'd been in the 42nd floor conference room. He told me that he'd already called IT and that my laptop had been remotely wiped 10 minutes ago. Then he said the words that made my blood run cold. He told me that if I didn't hand over the drive in my pocket and sign a voluntary resignation letter by 8 a.m., he was going to release a security report to the press showing that I'd been harvesting client data to sell to a competitor. He said he'd already planted the evidence on my home network. He smiled that thin, polished smile and told me that in this town, nobody cares about a diversity officer who turns out to be a corporate spy. He told me to have a good night and think about my father's reputation before I did something I'd regret. Then he rolled up the window and drove off, leaving me standing there in the middle of the street, realizing that the red tag system wasn't just a way to keep people out. It was a weapon. They used to bury anyone who tried to get in. The walk from the subway to my apartment felt like a walk to my own execution. I didn't turn on the lights when I got inside. I just sat on the edge of my bed, the blue light of the street lamps filtering through the blinds, and I realized Alistair hadn't just threatened me. He'd told me that my life, everything my father had worked for and everything I had built, was his to delete. I checked my home router. Sure enough, the log showed a remote access connection from the office server at 11:45 p.m. They were already uploading the evidence of the data breach. Files with names like Client Portfolio, Confidential, and Trade Secrets Q4 were being dumped into a hidden folder on my personal drive. If I went to the police or the board now, Alistair would just pull the trigger, and I'd be the one in handcuffs while he was hailed as a corporate hero who caught a spy. I felt this cold, paralyzing weight in my chest. For a second, I actually thought about signing the resignation. I thought about taking the $100,000 from Arthur, moving back to Brooklyn, and just trying to disappear. But then, I looked at the picture on my nightstand of my dad on his retirement day, standing in front of his bus with that proud, tired smile. He didn't raise me to be a diversity shield for a criminal. I knew I couldn't use my phone or my laptop. Everything I touched was probably being mirrored to Alistair's security team. So, I did the only thing I could. I walked 3 blocks to a 24-hour bodega, bought a burner phone with cash, and sent a single text to the number Sampson had given me in the secret room. All I wrote was, "The trap is set. Midnight at the diner." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a back booth of a Greasy Spoon on 14th Street. Sampson, Chloe, and David showed up one by one, looking like they'd seen a ghost. I told them about the SUV, the frame job, and the remote upload. Chloe actually started shaking. She said that if Alistair was willing to go this far, we were in way over our heads. She wanted out. She told me she had a mortgage and a kid, and she couldn't risk going to prison for a corporate dispute. I looked at her and told her it wasn't a dispute anymore. I told her that Alistair had already made his choice. If I went down, the first thing he was going to do was scrub the 42nd floor of anyone who had ever looked at him the wrong way. I told her that being silent wasn't going to save them. It was just going to make it easier for him to pick them off one by one. David, the guy from legal, was the one who shifted the energy. He leaned in and told us that the security report Alistair was planning to use had a weakness. In the Sterling Cross bylaws, any internal investigation involving an executive director requires a third-party audit before it can be released to the board. Alistair was trying to bypass that by leaking it to the press first to create a scandal that would force the board's hand. But David had something else. He'd been digging into the consulting fee firm. It wasn't just a shell company for Alistair. One of the primary beneficiaries was a man named Senator Higgins. He was the head of the committee that oversaw the very media regulations Sterling Cross was constantly trying to lobby. This wasn't just a hiring scam, it was a political bribery ring. That was the moment I realized we didn't just have a whistleblower case. We had a nuclear bomb. We spent the rest of the night at that diner mapping out the counter-strike. The Global Innovation Summit was only 48 hours away. It was the biggest event of the year for the firm. Every major investor, the entire board, and half of the city's political elite would be in the room. Alistair was scheduled to give the keynote address on the future of ethical media. Sampson told me he could get me into the AV booth. He said that since he was the one who built the data visualizations for the presentation, he had the master override for the main screens. But he needed me to get him the raw files from the special interest folder, the ones they'd deleted from my access. I told him I knew where the back door was. When they wiped my laptop, they didn't realize I'd already mirrored the HR database to a secure offline server I'd set up during my first week, back when I was still paranoid about the firm's security culture. But there was a catch. To activate the transfer to the summit's main feed, someone had to be physically present at the office to bypass the biometric lock on the server room. And it had to happen while Alistair was on stage so he couldn't kill the signal from his phone. David looked at me and asked, "What about the frame job?" He said that even if we exposed the hiring ring, Alistair would still release the espionage report and ruin my life. I told him that was the risk I was taking. I told him that if we did this right, by the time the security report hit the press, Alistair Caldwell would be the least credible man in New York City. I asked them if they were in. I told them I wouldn't blame them if they walked away, but that this was the only chance we'd ever have to stop the red tag system for good. One by one, they nodded. We didn't have a name for our group anymore. We weren't the Silent Floor. We were Rebellion. The next day was the longest 24 hours of my life. I went into the office at 8 a.m., just like Alistair told me to. I walked into his office, and he was sitting there with a man I'd never seen before, a guy in a dark suit who looked like he'd spent his whole life in the shadows of a courthouse. Alistair didn't even look up from his coffee. He just gestured to a document on his desk and told me to sign it. He said it was a voluntary resignation and a non-disclosure agreement. He said that if I signed it now, the security report would stay in his desk, and I'd be allowed to leave with my reputation intact. I looked at the document, and then I looked at Alistair. I told him I'd think about it, but that I had some final files to organize for the transition. Alistair chuckled, a dry, hollow sound, and told me I had until the end of the day. He said that once he stepped on that stage at the summit the next morning, the deal was off the table. I walked out of his office, and as I passed the 42nd floor, I saw Sampson. He didn't look at me, but he dropped a small encrypted keycard onto a printer as he walked by. I swiped it without breaking my stride. That night, I didn't go home. I knew Alistair's security guys were probably waiting for me there. I stayed in a cheap hotel near the venue, watching the clock tick down. I thought about my dad. I thought about Andre, who was probably out there right now applying for another job where some guy with a red tag system was going to look at his name and hit delete. I realized that Alistair wasn't just a boss. He was a gatekeeper. And tomorrow morning, I was going to tear the gates down, even if I had to go down with them. The morning of the Global Innovation Summit felt like the humidity before a massive storm. I was standing in a service elevator at the Sterling Cross headquarters, wearing a high-visibility vest I'd stolen from a maintenance closet and carrying a toolbox that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. While the rest of the corporate world was 3 blocks away at the Grand Hyatt, sipping artisan coffee and waiting to hear Alistair Caldwell talk about the future of ethics, I was deep in the bowels of the building he thought he owned. The server room was protected by a biometric lock that required a level of clearance I didn't have, but that's where Sampson's encrypted keycard came in. He'd found a way to spoof the system into thinking a senior security tech was performing an emergency update. When the light on the scanner turned from red to a steady, pulsing green, my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might actually trigger an alarm on its own. I slipped inside, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. The hum of the servers was a constant, low-frequency roar that made my teeth ache. I found the main terminal and plugged in the drive. On my burner phone, I had a live feed of the summit's main stage. I watched as Alistair walked out to thunderous applause. He looked perfect. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, and he had this practiced, humble smile that he only used when he was about to lie to people with a lot of money. Alistair started his speech by talking about the American dream, and how Sterling Cross was a place where merit was the only currency that mattered. He even had a slide showing a photo of me, calling me a visionary leader, who was helping the firm reach new heights of inclusivity. I felt a wave of nausea. He was using my face as a prop for his lies while he had a digital hit piece ready to destroy me the second he stepped off that stage. I looked at the terminal screen. The upload was at 80%. I sent a text to Sampson, targeting the master override. Give me 2 minutes. Back on the screen, Alistair was hitting his stride. He started talking about the special interest initiatives, claiming that the firm had seen a 40% increase in diverse hiring under his leadership. That was the cue. I hit the final command on the terminal. The code I'd written with David and Sampson didn't just upload the files, it hijacked the video signal for the entire venue. 1 second, Alistair was standing in front of a beautiful graphic of a growing tree. The next second, the screen behind him went black, and then a massive, high-definition spreadsheet appeared. It was the red tag ledger. At the top of the screen, in bold red letters that were probably 20 feet tall, it read, Sterling Cross Media, the Legacy Price List. The silence in that ballroom must have been deafening. I watched Alistair turn around, his face going from smug confidence to a pale, sickly gray in a matter of seconds. The screen started scrolling through the names. It showed the resumes of people like Andre, qualified, brilliant, red-tagged, and then it showed the legacy hire who got the job instead. Next to each one, it listed the consulting fee, paid by the parents and the shell company it went to. But we weren't done. The next slide was the one that David had found. It was a direct scan of a ledger showing the payments to Senator Higgins. The names of the board members who had authorized the referral bonuses were highlighted in neon yellow. It was a roadmap of corruption, presented to the very people who had the power to burn the whole thing down. Alistair was frozen. He looked like a man watching his own execution in real time. He tried to keep talking, his voice cracking as he told the audience that this was a technical glitch and a vicious hack by a disgruntled employee. But then, the audio feed changed. Sampson had patched in the recording I'd made of my dinner with Arthur Sterling. Arthur's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers, clear as a bell. We heard him telling me that the system wasn't a glitch but the foundation. We heard him calling me a diversity shield and offering me $100,000 to keep my mouth shut. The recording ended with Arthur saying that sometimes you have to take care of the children of investors so the company can stay alive. The feed showed the audience now. People were standing up. Investors were on their phones, probably calling their brokers to dump Sterling Cross stock before the market even opened. I saw Senator Higgins, who was sitting in the front row, get up and practically run for the exit, followed by a swarm of reporters who had realized this was the story of the decade. My phone buzzed. It was a call from Alistair. I didn't answer it. Then a text came, through from an unknown number. It was Arthur. It just said, "You have no idea what you've started. You're dead in this city." I didn't care. I watched as security guards at the Hyatt finally reached the AV booth, but Samson had already slipped out the back. I pulled my drive from the server terminal and started heading for the exit. I knew the security report about my supposed espionage was probably being sent to the press at that very second, but it didn't matter. No one was going to believe a word that came out of Sterling Cross Media after today. As I walked out of the server room, I ran into Gwen Holloway, the head of HR. She was standing there with 2 security guards, her face tight with a mix of fear and fury. She told me I was under arrest for corporate espionage and data theft. She said I was a traitor to the man who gave me a chance. I looked at her, and I didn't feel any fear. I told her that the only traitors in this building were the ones who sold the American dream to the highest bidder while they tagged everyone else as a culture risk. I told her she could call the police if she wanted, but they were probably already on their way to talk to Alistair and Arthur. Then I walked past her. The security guards didn't even move. They just stood there, looking at each other, realizing that the people they were supposed to be protecting were about to be the lead story on every news channel in the country. I walked out of the lobby and into the bright Manhattan sun. My phone was blowing up with notifications. The stock was in freefall. The EEOC had already released a statement saying they were opening an immediate investigation. It was the gala sting we'd dreamed of, and it had worked better than I ever could have imagined. But as I saw a line of Blacktown cars speeding away from the Hyatt, I knew that Alistair Caldwell wasn't the kind of man to go down without one last desperate strike. The silence that follows a bomb going off is always louder than the explosion itself. I remember sitting on a park bench in Battery Park about an hour after I walked out of that building, just watching the ferries go back and forth. My phone was vibrating so much it felt like it was going to melt through my pocket. I had missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, texts from former colleagues who were suddenly my best friends, and 3 separate urgent emails from the Sterling Cross legal department. Alistair did exactly what he said he'd do. Within 2 hours of the presentation, a security bulletin was leaked to a major business news outlet. The headline was something about a disgruntled director harvesting trade secrets and attempting to extort the company. They tried to paint me as a corporate spy, a thief who had been caught and was lashing out. But here's the thing about trying to frame someone for a crime while you're currently being investigated for 3 bigger ones. Nobody believes you. Because the files I'd released didn't just show secrets, they showed a systemic civil rights violation and federal bribery. The FBI and the EEOC didn't care about Alistair's security report. They cared about the bank records showing 6-figure payments to a senator and the red tag system that looked like something out of a 1950s segregation handbook. By the time the sun went down that day, the FBI had already raided the Sterling Cross executive offices. The fallout was like a slow-motion demolition. Alistair Caldwell was arrested 3 days later at a private airport in New Jersey. Turns out he was trying to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty, carrying 2 suitcases that weren't filled with clothes. He's currently facing charges of racketeering, bribery, and wire fraud. His pedigree didn't save him when the DOJ got a look at those consulting fees. Arthur Sterling, the man who thought he could buy my silence with $100,000, didn't go to jail, but he suffered, a fate that was probably worse for a man like him. He was forced into a shame retirement by the board. His name was stripped from the university wings he'd funded, and the firm he spent 40 years building was sold off in pieces to a competitor for pennies on the dollar. His legacy didn't just crumble, it was erased. As for the silent floor, they weren't silent anymore. When the investigation went public, Samson, Chloe, and David became the primary witnesses. They didn't just give the authorities the files, they gave them the stories. They told them about every skipped promotion, every stolen idea, and every red tag rejection they'd witnessed. The company ended up paying out a massive collective settlement to hundreds of former applicants who had been bypassed. And then there was Andre. About a month after the dust settled, I tracked him down. I called him up and told him the whole story. I told him why he really didn't get that job and what his resume had been used for. He was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. Then he told me that he'd actually started to doubt himself after that rejection. He'd started to think that maybe his work wasn't as good as he thought it was. Hearing the truth, he said, felt like someone had finally opened a window in a room where he'd been running out of air. People always ask me if I regret it. They see that I'm not at a billion-dollar firm anymore, and they think I lost. But the truth is, I've never felt more successful. I used my settlement money and some of my savings to start a new kind of firm. We call it the Open Gate. We don't have special interest folders or social capital scores. We build talent strategies for companies that actually want to grow, not just protect a country club atmosphere. Samson is my head of data now. Chloe runs our finance. And Andre? He was our very first client, and now he's a partner. We're not the biggest firm in Manhattan, not yet anyway, but we're the one that everyone is talking about. Looking back, Alistair was right about one thing. He told me that I had to learn which battles were worth fighting. He just didn't realize that I was the one who was going to decide the rules of the engagement. My father used to tell me that a seat at the table is only worth something if you can look the person sitting across from you in the eye without feeling ashamed. I don't have the corner office with the view of the Hudson anymore. I don't wear the $3,000 suits, but every morning when I walk into my own office and see a team of people who are there because of their talent and nothing else, I know I made the right call. The gatekeepers think they can hold the line forever, but they always forget one thing. Gates can be opened, and if they won't give you the key, you can always just take the hinges off.
Thanks for watching and listening to Manhattan Exposes. What story would you like to hear next? Drop it in the comments below, and kindly leave a like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Until next time.